Thanks so much, and I can only be thankful that they didn't have cell phone cameras back when I was working in Washington Square Park. It's exciting to be here today, back in the neighborhood I grew up in, speaking about this really important topic in a room filled with people, all of whom know more about AI than me, but at least I have comparative advantage in thinking about issues of labor markets. And for any of you who studied economics, that doesn't even mean I necessarily know more about it. I just know comparatively more relative to the AI side of the spectrum. I think you can put people's views about the economic impact of AI in a matrix. And a lot of people inhabit three parts of that matrix. Two dimensions to it. One is, do you think AI is going to be something profoundly different that forces us to rewrite the rules of economics? Or do you think it'll just be a continuity of the same thing? And then the second question is whether you think it'll do great things or you're pessimistic and worried about it. I would say most economists are in that it's not particularly different than what's before. It's not going to take all our jobs. In fact, we've had hundreds of years of new technologies that have replaced all sorts of things we used to do, but created all sorts of new jobs and raised wages and increased prosperity in the process. And that this time is different. You have the robots will take all our jobs, and you have the people that are optimistic about that and think we'll get to relax a lot more, and the people who are pessimistic and think it'll be some sort of robot apocalypse. I put myself in the continuity camp. This time will be similar. But having observed the impact that technology has had on labor markets, on inequality, and on labor force participation over the last several decades, I think that continuity from our past experience isn't completely comforting and brings with it a set of challenges and problems, even if they're not exactly what the robots will take all our jobs people would have us worry about. I want to talk about those concerns today. But before I talk about those concerns, I want to talk about what's probably my biggest concern, which is that we won't get enough AI. And with any innovation, our first, second, and third reaction should be to celebrate it, to be excited about it, and to figure out what we can do to get more of it. But then our fourth and fifth reaction should be to understand its downsides and what we could do about all of those. And if there's any theme I have in my comments today, it's that we shouldn't think of any of this as technologically determined. We see huge variations in experience across countries with inequality, with labor force participation, with productivity growth, and that suggests that policies and institutions are going to play a really large role in whether we take the more optimistic branch or the more pessimistic branch. So let me start with the we don't have enough AI. And here, I experience whiplash because sometimes I'm in rooms of economists and they're looking at the latest productivity numbers, and the latest productivity numbers are invariably terrible across a range of advanced economies. In fact, 30 of the 31 advanced economies had lower productivity growth in the last decade than they did in the decade before that. The United States has had the highest productivity growth of any of the major advanced economies in the last decade, but we too have experienced a slowdown from 2.3% to 1.1%. There's a considerable amount of debate about the degree to which measurement error plays a role in this, and I have no doubt that the 1.1 number doesn't capture the full range of innovation in the last decade, and true productivity growth is higher than that. But I also have no doubt that the 2.3% doesn't count the full range of innovation in that decade either, a decade that saw the essential invention of the World Wide Web, search, e-commerce, email, and the widespread adoption of cell phones. So I would shift both of those bars up, and a range of recent research suggests little reason to doubt that the delta between the two of them is seriously misstated. That doesn't mean that technology isn't doing all sorts of exciting things. It is. If you look at robotics, for example, we've seen a large increase in shipments of robots in recent years. Some evidence is that between 1993 and 2007, they added 0.4% to our productivity growth and were responsible for 1/10 of our growth since then. We're seeing advances in AI, especially in the area of deep learning, many of them grounded in research that was originally funded by DARPA and neural networks, that is changing the way we detect fraud, do radiology, and engage in criminal justice in a wide range of areas that all of you know so well. But it's still it's still something that is very application specific, and a lot of effort is needed to take an advance in one area and figure out how to translate it into a future area. I think it's perfectly possible that we'll get faster and better at that. We've seen many historical precedents for productivity growth coming in waves, electricity, where you get an initial wave, then you have to figure out a little bit more how to use it, and you get a second wave. I think that's perfectly possible, but I certainly wouldn't count on it. And whether it happens depends on some of the policy choices we make that I'll discuss towards the end of my remarks today. I want to talk now, though, about some of the potential downsides in terms of labor markets. The typical economist response to the robots will take all our jobs is persuasive. It points to the last several hundred years, all sorts of things were about to take all of our jobs, and yet for most of the last couple hundred years, at any point in time, about 95% of the people that want a job can have one. It's important, though, to understand why this happens, and this happens because labor markets, while they're not exactly the textbook market in wheat, and they have some important differences and major caveats, to a broad approximation, operate by the laws of supply and demand, and as supply and demand curves move around, the wage adjusts in order to clear the labor market. That shouldn't be wholly comforting to us, because part of the way the wage adjusts is it can adjust down so that people are more attractive to hire. And that's what we've seen over the last several decades as technology has complemented people with high skills, replaced people with middle and, in some cases, lower skills, and has led to a large decline in the relative wages of less skilled workers. So if you're saying the robots won't take all our jobs, the reason that's happening is because the robots are successfully bidding down the wages and the people are keeping themselves in those jobs. If you look forward and try to understand what this might be like, one way to think about it is to use Frey and Osborne's numbers. And there's a lot of controversy around this. The OECD has much lower ones. But I want to present them as just a stylized example of what the inequality pressures might look like. And you see at CEA, we took their headline 50% statistic and broke it down by the wage of the occupations that they said were at risk of being replaced by robots, and found that for people making less than $20 an hour, it was 83%. In between $20 and $40 an hour, it was 31%, and above $40 an hour, it was 4%. Now, the right way to read that chart isn't that 83% of people who make less than $20 an hour are going to lose their jobs and be unemployed. The right way to read that is that there'll be more pressure on their wages and more downward pressure on their wages as a result of this technology than there is at the upper end. Of course, we're uncertain. We can't predict these things, but the magnitude of the differences there makes me worried about inequality. As I referenced in the beginning, though, I think it would be a real mistake to say that inequality is purely a function of technology. If you look at the evolution of inequality in the United States in the last several decades, it's not just that we've had skill-biased technological change, it's also that we actually slowed down the rate at which we were increasing education, in particular increasing college education, and also that we saw a large decline in unions and a relative inflation-adjusted decline in the minimum wage. And these types of policy choices and institutions are why we've seen inequality evolve so differently across a range of countries. And in the United States, we've had not only the highest inequality of any of the G7 economies since the mid-1980s, but also the fastest increase in inequality as well. So choices really matter here. While the robots taking all our jobs, I think, is naive and flies in the face of centuries of evidence, I am a little bit worried about the impact they'll have on jobs. And that impact doesn't come from thinking that robots are something different from what we've seen in the past, but the worry that they might actually be the same as what we've seen over the past 50 or 60 years. The Council of Economic Advisors, about 2 weeks ago, we put out a major report on the decline in the labor force participation rate for prime-age men between the age of 25 and 54, over the last 60 years. And I think analytically, if you want to understand the future of the workforce for both men and women, this is a good laboratory to look at. Because if you look at the history of women, all sorts of other things in terms of culture were happening that are less so in the future. What you see when you look at men between 25 and 54 is that 98% of them were in the workforce in the 1950s. Now it's 88% of them in the workforce. And that decline is primarily concentrated among men with a high school education or less. That decline in labor force participation appears to be caused by many things, but one of the most important is a reduction in the demand for less skilled labor. When you get a reduction in demand, the quantity goes down, which is participation in the workforce, and the price goes down, which is the relative wage or the inequality that I was just talking about. And this seems to stem also from the way the U.S. economy has handled turnover. As recession hit, people lose their job. What can you do to get people back on their feet and into a job? Just like inequality, though, I wouldn't treat this as technologically determined. I would treat this as mediated by the institutions and policies that we have chosen to adopt. And if you look here, and if you can mentally subtract the dot, which gives you the number for labor force participation in 1990, from the bar, which is 2014, you can see that the United States had the second largest decline in labor force participation for prime-age men over the last quarter century, and has among the lowest labor force participation, something that I think has to do with the fact that we have labor market institutions that, while very flexible, much more than most European countries, are very bad at being supportive, helping to connect people to jobs, active labor market policies, and supporting them in those jobs. Want to now talk about what the implications of all of this is for public policy. The first implication is, I think, that a universal basic income, or UBI, would be the wrong way to go to deal with these issues. UBI has lots of different motivations from lots of different people. It could be designed in lots of different ways. But as a general rule, especially in technology circles, the premise has often been, the robots will take our jobs. We need to do something for people. Let's give them an income. The diagnosis that I've just given you is not that. It's not that your job will be replaced. It's that because of the turnover in jobs, that'll create all sorts of new jobs, all sorts of new opportunities. The question is, will we have labor market institutions that help connect people to those opportunities and keep what we would call the labor force participation rate up, or will it continue trending down as it has for the last many decades? So I think the technological premise underlying UBI is flawed. The second thing we're worried about with AI and technological development more broadly is it'll increase inequality. And if the way UBI is designed is to replace the current social safety net, which is enormously progressive, the net result would be giving more to people higher up the income spectrum and less to people towards the bottom, unless we were able to raise taxes as a share of GDP to levels that we haven't seen in the United States, and I wouldn't count on us being able to see any time in the near future. As an aside, there's a whole nother motivation for UBI, which comes less out of the tech space and more out of a longstanding dissatisfaction with the social welfare system, that I think is equally flawed. And a range of modern research using a range of credible new research has found both that some of the downsides of programs like SNAP, unemployment insurance, and Medicaid for work incentives are considerably less than previously thought, and their upsides in terms of increasing long-range mobility for children that receive these programs in terms of higher income, education, and better health are considerably larger than we previously thought. So the question then is what we should be doing. When it comes to the labor market side, we should be doing a lot whether or not we're in a room of technologists talking about AI. We need to be doing more to improve the distribution of income, both the pre-tax distribution of income by expanding the voice of workers and raising the minimum wage, and the post-tax distribution of income, and the first also with education, and the post-tax distribution of income by, for example, expanding the earned income tax credit and making the tax system more progressive overall. I think we also need to think seriously about what we can do to help connect more people to jobs and find meaningful work, so we don't continue the slide, which, as I said, we've seen for men for about 60 years, and we've seen for women paralleling men for the last 15 years. And that involves having labor market institutions that are more supportive while also taking steps like improving education. But when it comes to AI in particular, as I said at the beginning, I think our biggest problem is we just don't have enough of it, and we don't have enough productivity growth. Most of the solution to that is going to be found in the private sector. The private sector last year spent $2.4 billion on AI, while the federal government spent $200 million. But I think we also have an important role to play and some major choices, and I wanted to just very briefly list that in 5 different areas. The first is basic research. You've seen a real disconnect. The American businesses are spending 1.8% of GDP on research every year, R&D every year. That's the highest as a share of the economy that we've ever seen from American businesses. At the same time, the share of GDP that the government has devoted to research has fallen since the 1960s. And that's a big problem because 60% of the basic research in our country is still funded by the federal government. There's substantial spillovers to research, and thus reasons to believe it would be underprovided by the private sector. And a reasonable estimate is that the optimal level of federal support for research would be 2 to 4 times higher than what we're doing today. The president's budget proposes a 4% increase in R&D. It proposes to expand the R&E tax credit to provide an incentive for the private sector to do research. And a lot of this is important also not just in the amount, but in leveraging those resources. So something like a DARPA Grand Challenge for autonomous vehicles helped really motivate and stimulate a set of work above and beyond just the amount of money at stake. The second area I would highlight is the workforce for AI itself. Machines may have beaten champions at Jeopardy, chess, and Go, but those machines were designed and programmed by teams of human beings, and we need to continue to have trained people to make all of this work. Immigration is one important part of that. By some estimates, 30 to 50% of our productivity growth in the last couple decades has come from immigrants in the STEM area, and more of that is important. But at the same time, efforts like WIOA, the Tech Hire Initiative the administration has put forward for 17 to 29-year-olds to give them the skills, and making sure that not everyone is moving from universities to the private sector, which we can do in part with more research funding to make it more attractive to be at universities. Third area I would list is competition policy. Competition is critical to innovation in the economy. It's too soon to understand fully the ways that AI and the set of technological developments we're going through will change and affect the way that we think about it, but it's something important to continue to focus and think about, both in the administration and our independent regulators like the FTC, represented by Terrell McSweeney here today. The fourth area I'd highlight is privacy, which is essential for the trust that we need to operate in a world of increasingly big data that machines are playing an increasingly large role in. It's been a big effort of the administration. I'm taking a multi-stakeholder approach, putting out a number of reports and trying to raise awareness of the issue. And then finally, cybersecurity, which has been another big focus of the administration. We put out the Cyber National Action Plan this past year, called for $19 billion of funding, a 35% increase. And that's an area where it's not just funding, but also research, things like the DARPA Cyber Grand Challenge, to see if you can have AI learn how to defend itself, not just on the other side of it. So I'd conclude by saying I think you're going to have a set of really important discussions today. I hope that at least some of this was persuasive, but the one point I feel most strongly about is the discussion about predicting the future and what technology is or isn't going to cause is the wrong discussion to have. The right one is, how will we shape that future and what role will public policy have? Because you see just very different experiences across countries, very different experiences over time. None of that is determined by public policy. It may be affected by it, but it's really critically shaped by the choices we make as well. Thank you.
So now, kindly, Jason Furman has agreed to take some questions. So you're actually going to be up here. So you can't run away just yet. But Chairman Furman has been extraordinary in setting this day to already critique technological determinism, show us some really staggering job figures, and already to jump into the universal basic income debate. So thank you for that amazing starter. What we're going to do now is take questions. We're going to take them two at a time because obviously a lot of people are going to have questions to ask. So if you could raise your name badges, production staff are going to bring mics to you, and we can come and take your questions. Fantastic. We have just one over here and just one up the back there. Thanks. Keep your name tense up so we can see you.
Yes. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. My question is about the connection that you made. It's around the statement that we don't have enough AI, and the connection that you made between research and development in AI and productivity growth. And I wonder if you could just say more about, in part I'm looking for more specifically what comes in under the category of AI for you, and how, you mentioned the DARPA Grand Challenge, but then I wonder how that contributes to productivity growth. Mm-hmm. So as an example.
If I'm Dana Boyd, if I'm correct, the OECD numbers don't actually include incarcerated peoples, which actually means that the growth that we're seeing or the changes in workforce dynamics around the 25 to 54 are even more magnificent given the increase of incarceration in the United States. I'm curious, if I think about some of these other trends, the increase of women entering into the workforce, the increase of incarcerated people within the workforce, how do those factors come into play as we think about that broader market dynamic?
Great. So on the first one, on your first question, if you look at something like cybersecurity, for example, you sort of wish that was a waste of money and something that we didn't need to do. And to the degree that we can do it more efficiently and spend less time worrying about it, we can spend more time worrying about other things. Conversely, to the degree it becomes a bigger problem, it's going to really interfere with our ability to deploy and use these sets of systems. And the more things are connected in networks and acting autonomously, the less there is a human to just have the common sense to intervene and stop something from happening. So I think this is in some ways, a prerequisite to productivity growth in the same way that, a country needs an army and a police force to make sure that other countries aren't invading it and people aren't stealing things from each other. That itself isn't the most exciting aspect of technological change, but you won't get all the other technological change without having some version of that. But certainly our work in the government has to go well beyond that. And again, the idea of basic research is often not that you know exactly what it's going to do or how you can make money from it. It's something that is interesting, that you're curious about, and you figure out how to adapt in different ways. And AI would just be one of the many areas for that. In terms of labor force participation, I'd be happy to take up an hour of everyone's time with it. We do have a report on our website from about 2 weeks ago, but you're certainly right. Incarceration masks some of the decline in labor force participation because those people are removed from the denominator of the numbers. And if you're looking at one of the reasons why we've seen a worse trend in the United States than other countries, is that we've seen a much larger rise in mass incarceration in the United States than other countries, and have the second highest percentage of our population behind bars, exceeded only by the Seychelles, which has 200,000 people and a disproportionate number of them in prison.
We have a question here up the front and another up the back. If you could just say your name and affiliation, that would be wonderful.
Hi, Jason. Thank you for a great talk. I'm Guru Manavar from IBM. My question was about the industry sectors and how they are likely going to see the change in all the impact of AI, whether it's positive or negative. And what are your thoughts on specifically focusing on certain sectors to accelerate the right metrics?
Yeah. Oh, are you taking two?
We're going to take two. Just the second one up here. Lily, if you could just say your name and affiliation, and you have a microphone just coming to you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Lily Irani from UC San Diego. You mentioned income tax credits as one way of changing the distribution of the value that gets produced in the economy. So if we have a growing number of independent contractors in the economy who are not subject to minimum wage laws, how do you think about addressing that as a problem?
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to make a good excuse for the ignorance I have in the answer to your question on the industries and say that everyone else in this room knows a lot more about that than I do, and that's a good thing because our job shouldn't be to figure out this is a great industry, that is a great industry, but to understand in a more general way what can let competition, markets, private decisions shape that and shape the future of the economy. Now, there are specific areas where there's an important regulatory nexus, for example, that if you look at something like autonomous vehicles, there's an important role for government to play in both fostering their development and making sure that that development is done safely. But that's different from saying, we've decided that is the industry that we want to target. I suspect even many of the people in this room who are wiser on that topic themselves would be surprised about what areas it would help, what industries we'll see and what we won't. In terms of your question, one of the good things about the tax system is that is universal. So whether you're a contractor, what type of employment you are, you get it. And one advantage of the Earned Income Tax Credit is, in effect, a wage subsidy. So if you have 2 children, for each dollar you earn, you get 40 cents extra from the government. So it both rewards and encourages work and helps increase labor force participation, as opposed to, in effect, giving up on labor force participation and just handing you cash.
And we have a question just up here at the front from Frank Pasquale. If I could just get a mic, thank you. And then the second question will be coming from row number 2 with Heather.
Thank you. Frank Pasquale, University of Maryland. And I noticed that I'd love to hear a bit more about 2 aspects of your 5-part policy vision, one of which was you mentioned competition law. Mm-hmm. And I guess one area there might be if we're concerned that most of the data is concentrated in very large firms, we might want to increase access to it. But you also mentioned privacy. And it seems that our privacy concerns would pull in the opposite direction, that we'd want to restrict access to data. Is there a way out of that tension?
I think that's exactly the right question and discussion that we need to have, that access to data, is it something like a critical resource that is supporting, foreclosing entry into the sector? How can you foster that entry while dealing with those concerns about privacy? And I'm sure Terrell will knows the answer to that and will tell you later if you ask her. But I think that's exactly the conversation we need to be having.
And we have a final question here from Heather Roth.
Hi, Heather Roth, Oxford in Arizona State. So you positioned in your talk a lot about the notion of structural inequalities, or at least you kind of waved in that direction between the income distribution being high rises of inequality, and you motioned to policy as a way of getting out of this, as well as increasing education as a way of mediating this. My question to you is how you see institutional design between matching people to jobs and increasing education while navigating existing structural inequalities within those systems. I mean, how you wouldn't just perpetuate those same existing structural inequalities that are here through your... Do you have policy kind of ideas going forward on that to not mask them? Thank you.
Yeah. And I'm not, and just to be clear, I'm not education only, and I skated quickly over the set of policies in that area, and this, again, if we had an hour, I'd be happy to spend that amount of time on it. Education is, makes you much more likely to get a higher wage, and it also makes you much more likely to work. College graduates have a much lower unemployment rate, they're much less affected by recessions, and they haven't experienced this slide, or nearly the same magnitude of the slide in labor force participation that people without a college education. So I think more access to college, so that's expanding Pell Grants, some reforms to student loan programs. And it's not just access, but the quality of the college matters. So in the for-profit sector, for example, we've seen a lot of people that get degrees that aren't worth very much and end up defaulting, and that has all sorts of ramifications for them. So reforming the for-profit sector, which is something we've done in this administration, and focusing really on college completion, because if you look at the people who aren't repaying their student loans, an awful lot of them are people that actually dropped out and didn't finish. So there's a whole bunch of things we need to do there, but I would not, again, think that it's so structurally messed up that we shouldn't even try. I think there's a lot of good we can do. But anyway, thank you all for all of this, and I should say there's a slightly expanded version of these remarks that should be up on the Council of Economic Advisors website shortly, in case that's of interest.
Thank you so much, Chairman Furman.